There are places in the world where nothing seems to be in a hurry, where mornings arrive quietly, and evenings don't feel like something you have to escape from. A place where people are not constantly chasing more, yet somehow don't seem to have less. Tonight, we're going to spend some time in a country like that. A small kingdom, hidden in the mountains, known as Bhutan. In many parts of the world today, life moves quickly. Days are planned, hours are scheduled, and even rest often feels like something that needs to be earned. But in Bhutan, the pace feels different. Not dramatically slower, but noticeably softer. If you were to walk through a small town here in the early morning, you might notice how little urgency there is. Shops open without rush. People greet each other without looking at the time. And conversations seem to last just a little longer than expected. It's not that people in Bhutan don't work hard. They do. But the rhythm of their days is not built around constant acceleration. There is space between things. Space between work and rest. Between one task and the next. Even between words in a conversation. And in that space, something subtle begins to appear. A sense that time is not something you're constantly running out of. For many people from faster-paced countries, this feeling can be unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, at first, because when things slow down, there is less distraction, and when there is less distraction, you start to notice your own thoughts more clearly. But over time, that discomfort often fades, and what replaces it is a quiet kind of ease, the kind that doesn't come from doing more, but from not needing to. In Bhutan, life doesn't feel like a race that needs to be won. It feels more like something that is simply being lived. But a slower life like this doesn't simply happen on its own. In Bhutan, it has been protected, carefully, and deliberately. For a long time, this small mountain kingdom remained largely hidden from the outside world. Not because it couldn't open its doors, but because it chose not to. Modern roads came late. Television was only introduced in 1999. And even today, tourism is still quietly controlled. If you wanted to visit Bhutan, you wouldn't simply book a flight and arrive. There are rules, daily fees, limits on how you move, and where you go. At first, this might feel unusual, even restrictive. In a world where travel is often about freedom, Bhutan seems to do the opposite. It slows you down before you even arrive. But behind that decision, there is a different way of thinking, a quiet understanding that not everything needs to grow as quickly as possible. That opening too fast can sometimes mean losing something that cannot be replaced. Culture, identity, a sense of balance. In many places around the world, development arrives like a wave. Fast, powerful, and difficult to control. But in Bhutan, the approach has been different. More like a careful step than a sudden leap. Of course, this choice comes with trade-offs. Fewer opportunities, less exposure, a slower economy. But it also creates something rare. A kind of space where change happens gradually, where traditions are not immediately pushed aside, but allowed to remain and breathe. And for those who arrive from the outside, this can feel like stepping into a different rhythm entirely. Not just slower, but more intentional. As if the country itself is quietly asking a question: what is worth keeping, even as the world moves on? And perhaps that question leads to something even more unusual. Because in Bhutan, the measure of a country's success isn't what you might expect. In most parts of the world, progress is often counted in numbers. Economic growth, income, productivity, figures that rise. and fall, and are constantly compared. But in Bhutan, there is another idea, a quieter one, known as gross national happiness. At first, it can sound almost abstract, even idealistic. How do you measure something like happiness? Can it really be counted the way we count money? But in Bhutan, this idea is taken seriously, not as a slogan, but as a direction. Instead of asking, how much are we producing? The question becomes, how are people actually living? Are they healthy? Do they feel connected to their community? Do they have time to rest, to think, to simply be? It doesn't mean that money doesn't matter. Of course it does. But it is not placed at the very center. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, changes the way decisions are made. Development is considered, but not at any cost. Growth is welcomed, but not without reflection. There is an attempt to balance progress with well-being, to move forward without losing something essential along the way. For many people hearing this from the outside, it can feel both refreshing and unfamiliar, because in a world that often rewards speed and constant achievement, the idea of slowing down, to ask whether life actually feels good, is not always a priority. And yet, that question quietly remains, not just in Bhutan, but everywhere. What does it really mean to live well? And is it possible that having more does not always lead to feeling more? In Bhutan, there is no perfect answer, only an ongoing attempt to ask the question and not ignore it. And perhaps part of that answer can be found in something even quieter, something that doesn't appear in numbers at all, and yet quietly shapes the way people live. In Bhutan, spiritual life is not something separate. It is not reserved for special occasions or limited to certain places. It is simply there, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. You might notice it in the soft flutter of prayer flags stretching across the mountains, or in the slow, steady movement of prayer wheels turned gently by hand. Sometimes, you'll see monks walking through small towns, not in a hurry, not drawing attention, just passing by, as part of the same world as everyone else. There is no sharp boundary between what is considered spiritual and what is not, and because of that, the idea of pausing, of reflecting, doesn't feel like an interruption. It feels natural. In many places, silence can feel uncomfortable, something to be filled. But here, silence often feels different, less like emptiness, and more like space. A space where thoughts settle, instead of racing, where moments are not immediately replaced by the next thing. This doesn't mean that life in Bhutan is always calm, or that people don't struggle. They do. But there is a quiet awareness that not everything needs to be controlled, that some things can simply be observed. And in that observation, there is a kind of steadiness, not loud, not dramatic, but present. For those who come from busier worlds, this way of being can feel unfamiliar, even difficult at first, because when nothing is pulling your attention away, you are left with yourself. But over time, something begins to shift. The need to constantly fill the silence starts to fade, and what remains is a quieter kind of clarity, one that doesn't demand answers, but gently allows them to appear on their own. And perhaps part of that quiet clarity comes from something even more fundamental, the world around them, and the way they choose to live within it. In Bhutan, nature is not something distant. It is not a place you go to when you need a break. It is simply where life happens. Mountains stretch endlessly, layer after layer, fading into the mist. Forests feel dense, alive, and quietly undisturbed. Rivers move steadily, not rushing, but never still. And through all of this, there is a sense that the natural world is not separate from people, but something they are a part of. Bhutan is often described as one of the few carbon-negative countries in the world. But beyond the numbers, what's more noticeable is the feeling. The air feels different. The space feels open. There is less noise, less pressure, less need to constantly build or replace. In many places, nature is something that has been pushed to the edges, something to visit on weekends. But here, it remains close, present in daily life, not as an escape, but as a foundation. This closeness changes things. It changes how people move, how they build, how they think about time. Because when your surroundings follow a slower rhythm, it becomes harder to live, as if everything must happen instantly. Of course, this kind of balance is not effortless. It requires choices, limits, a willingness to say no, even when saying yes might bring faster growth. But what it creates is something that feels increasingly rare, a sense that life is not constantly pulling away from the world that sustains it. And for those who experience it, even briefly, there is often a quiet realization that perhaps being close to nature is not just about where you are, but about how you choose to exist within it. And yet, even in a place that feels this balanced, life is not without its challenges, because every choice, no matter how careful, comes with something in return. In Bhutan, the decision to move slowly, to protect culture, to limit change, also means that certain things do not come easily. Opportunities can feel limited. For younger generations, the world outside is no longer distant. Through screens, through stories, through quiet comparisons, they begin to see lives that move faster, offer more choices, and promise different kinds of success. And with that awareness, a quiet tension can begin to form between staying and leaving, between preserving what is and reaching for what could be. For some, the slower pace feels grounding. For others, it can feel restrictive. There are fewer career paths, fewer chances to explore different directions. And while life may feel calmer, it can also feel uncertain, especially for those who are trying to find their place in a rapidly changing world. Even the idea of happiness itself is not always simple, because what brings peace to one person may not be enough for another, and measuring well-being doesn't remove struggle. It only changes the way we choose to see it. None of this makes Bhutan less meaningful. If anything, it makes it more real, because no place, no matter how carefully shaped, is free from complexity. And perhaps that is what makes the question even more important. Not whether a place is perfect, but whether the life it offers is one you can truly live with, not just for a moment, but over time. And maybe that question doesn't just belong to Bhutan, because at some point, it becomes something more personal. If you were to live in a place like this, what would it feel like? Not just for a few days, or a quiet trip through the mountains, but as a life, a real one, waking up each morning, without the same urgency, moving through your day, at a slower pace, having less, but perhaps needing less. Would it feel peaceful? Or would it feel like something is missing? It's easy to admire a different way of living from a distance. to imagine that a quieter life might also be a better one. But when that quiet becomes everyday life, the experience can change. Because what we're used to doesn't disappear so easily. The need to grow, to explore, to become something more. These things don't vanish just because the world around us is calmer. And so, the question gently returns. Not as something that needs to be answered quickly, but as something worth sitting with. What does a good life actually look like for you? Is it a life of movement, of progress, of constant change? Or is it something quieter, something with more space, more stillness, more time to simply be? In Bhutan, there isn't a single answer, only a different way of asking the question. And perhaps that is what makes it meaningful. Not that it shows us how to live, but that it reminds us to pause and consider it for ourselves. And maybe tonight, that's enough. Not to decide, not to change anything, just to notice the life you already have, and the quiet spaces within it that are often overlooked. If this kind of story helps you slow down, you can always come back whenever you need it.